Good day. With the Kherson offensive now at a total standstill, it appears that Ukraine's efforts to launch an offensive somewhere is now focused increasingly on this offensive, which they've launched in Kharkov region towards the town of Balaklia and in the roads around it. There's even a report, which, like all of these reports, I'm not in any kind of position to corroborate, that President Zelensky has apparently now agreed to General Zaluzhny's demand that the Kherson offensive be called off and that the focus should now be shifted to this offensive in Kharkov region against Balaklia. Now, as I discussed in my program yesterday, one of the important things to bear in mind about this Ukrainian attack in Balaklia, and rather about the reporting about it, is that whereas the fighting in Kherson region is remote, it is going on in remote places along the Ingulets River principally, with few journalists and reporters there. The area of Donbass where this fighting around Balaklia is taking place is extremely rich in journalists and sources. Most of these journalists are highly opinionated people, and they all give their various accounts of what is happening, and they all give their various spin on what is happening. I should stress, when I say journalists, I mean Russian journalists. Ukraine continues to maintain extraordinary silence, both about the Kherson offensive and about this offensive against Balaklia. And in fact, there's been remarkably little actual information about the progress of this offensive, which is appearing even in the Western media. Well, we can actually, however, piece quite a lot together from what Russian reports say. We're now in the fourth day of this offensive. Allegedly, around 9,000 Ukrainian troops are involved, which is a significant force, but significantly smaller than the one which was committed to the Kherson offensive. This force managed to capture on the first day of the offensive a village near to Balaklia, but it's clear that Balaklia itself was not captured. As I discussed in my program yesterday, the National Guard troops, the Russian National Guard troops who were stationed in Balaklia, resolved to stay there, or perhaps were encouraged to do so by the Russian command. And I said that this was a clear indication that the Russians intended to make a fight for the place. And in fact, over the course of the next couple of hours, what happened was that those National Guard's troops were eventually withdrawn, but were replaced by Russian paratroopers. And the fact that the Russians were able to send paratroopers, airborne troops, to Balaklia, by the way, shows that the Balaklia itself is not fully cut off or surrounded from reinforcement, as some reports had suggested. Anyway, it's quite clear that the Ukrainians have not been able to attack Balaklia, and up to now they haven't even tried. Instead, what they did over the previous hours was that they sent flying columns of troops in small numbers up and down various rural roads to the north and south of Balaklia, trying to capture settlements as quickly as they could before the Russian reinforcements arrived. However, eventually Russian reinforcements did arrive in the form of more Russian paratroopers. There was some kind of a standoff at a village called Shevchenko, which is apparently the location of a major crossroads, and the Ukrainian troops, who were in small number, decided at that point that they turned back, and no actual fight took place. In fact, there doesn't seem to have been very much fighting so far in this offensive, any actual direct fighting, either between Russian infantry and Ukrainian infantry, or between the Ukrainians and militia infantry either. The numbers of troops involved up to now have been apparently on a relatively small scale, as one would expect from an assault force which apparently numbers in total around 9,000 men. Anyway, there has been an enormous amount of recriminations about this affair on the Russian side of the internet. There's been lots of complaints that the fact that these Ukrainian flying columns were able to penetrate so deep into Russian-controlled territory confirms that the Russian command hadn't taken the necessary precautions to secure Balaklia and the western flank of Russia's ETHEREUM grouping sufficiently. And there's been bitter recriminations and finger pointing about this, and talks for heads to roll and a lot of that kind of thing. Now, there's also lots of claims, including claims in the Western media, that the Russian military were taken by surprise by this affair. Now, that may be true up to a point, but I can't believe they were taken totally by surprise, if only because reports that the Ukrainians were building up forces for an attack on the west of the ETHEREUM grouping had been circulating in social media and in other places for at least 2 weeks. I've been reading about them. I've been well aware that these reports about these attacks, the preparation for a Ukrainian attack was underway. I suspect that what actually happened, is that the Russians knew that an attack of some sort was coming, weren't quite sure what form that attack would take. They weren't as well informed about Ukrainian plans as they clearly were about Ukrainian plans for their offensive in Kherson region. And so the result was that they kept most of their troops back, waiting to see where the Ukrainians would attack, and kept the front lines guarded by very small numbers of infantry. And all of the reports now say that the Russian Air Force and the Russian artillery is now in heavy operation, that they're shelling Ukrainian forces, and that the attack, at least the Balaklia part of the Ukrainian attack, is for the moment at least at a standstill. There are also reports that the Russians are moving reserves towards Balaklia, and that the question now is whether those reserves will get there in time to engage the Ukrainian forces that are trying to follow up on the initial attack against Balaklia. There's also other reports, by the way, that the Ukrainians are also trying to gather troops south of Balaklia, opposite in the southern areas north of Slavyansk, and focused upon ETHEREUM, with the attention perhaps not so much of attacking ETHEREUM itself, but of drawing Russian forces away from reinforcing the Russian troops in Balaklia. Now, one way or the other, this is a Ukrainian attack. It's made headlines. Whether it succeeds in the end or not, the fact that it has made headlines and that Ukraine has appeared to be on the offensive is something which the Ukrainians themselves will see as a win. And one can understand some of the Russian recriminations and bitterness about this. And there is, but I would add, one further point one should make, and that is that ever since the Russians captured ETHEREUM, back I think in March, it's been clear that this force that took ETHEREUM, and which many people expected would then march on towards Slavyansk, that it's been essentially it's essentially been at a kind of standstill, and that there have been constant attacks by the Ukrainians on its western flank. And it also seems to be the case that the Russians have never fully consolidated or hardened their defences in this western flank. I mean, there's been comments, one particular comment which I saw, which was, why weren't minefields laid on, to close off the road accesses, why weren't all kinds of things done to harden up the defences on the western flank? Not just, recently, but over a long period. Why did the Russian military allow this situation to arise at all, where this ETHEREUM grouping could be attacked in this way? And I think these are fair questions, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of bitter anger and recrimination about this. But I'm also going to make a guess, and it's of course obviously a guess or a speculation, that the Russians are not going to let this whole situation get out of control. Russian forces will be redeployed to this area before long in significant numbers. If troops have to be brought from within Russia to do it, they will be. And I suspect that at some point, eventually, this Ukrainian offensive will be contained, just as the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region has been contained. And about the second point, I think we are now close to saying that conclusively. The Russian Defense Ministry has now published another report about the general state of the military operation in Ukraine. Importantly, they say nothing about the fighting in Balaklia and ETHEREUM, but they do talk a lot about the fighting in Kherson region. And they say that the Ukrainians have carried out no offensive operations in Kherson region for another 24 hours. So that's another 48 hours in total where there have been no Ukrainian offensive operations in Kherson region. And in fact, the Russians claim that because of the very heavy losses Ukraine has suffered in this Kherson offensive, Ukrainian forces have been pulled back, and in some cases have made it clear that they're not prepared. Ukrainian units have made it clear that they're not prepared to engage in further operations in Kherson region. And again, we're getting reports of Russian reinforcements heading that way, and it's quite likely at some point that we will get more information, though with the focus now on Kharkov, on Balaklia, nobody seems interested in Kherson anymore, so we don't know very much. We don't have many updates about what's actually going on there. But anyway, regardless, I suspect that at some point over the next few days or weeks, we will discover that all of the Ukrainian gains in this Kherson offensive have been reversed. And it's not impossible that the Russians at some point might decide to go on the offensive there themselves. Anyway, whilst I'm on this subject, I will refer to a very interesting article that's appeared in the Washington Post, entitled "Wounded Ukrainian Soldiers Reveal Steep Toll of Kherson Offensive." It's behind a paywall, but the Moon of Alabama, Bernhardt, has provided us with extensive quotes, and they make actually quite harrowing reading. This is the Washington Post article. It says that the soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, fought this offensive in Kherson at a lopsided disadvantage. They say that they lacked artillery, the artillery needed to dislodge Russia's entrenched forces, and described a yawning technology gap with their better equipped opponents. One Ukrainian platoon commander says that the Ukrainian forces in this offensive lost 5 people for every Russian soldier that they killed. They complain that Russia's all-armed drones were operating at all times in the sky, and that the Ukrainian forces were under constant Russian observation, which is undoubtedly true, given that we're talking about the open fields, very little cover there. They talk rather strangely about Russian tanks emerging from newly built cement fortifications to blast into infantry with large caliber artillery, and then these vehicles, these tanks, would shrink back to their concrete shelters, sheltered from mortar and rocket fire. I don't actually think the Russians have deployed many tanks in Kherson region. I suspect that what we're talking about here is self-propelled artillery. But anyway, let's put all that aside. The Ukrainians complained that counter-battery radar systems, Russian counter-battery radar systems, automatically detected and located Ukrainians who were targeting the Russians with projectiles, unleashing a barrage of artillery fire in response. They said that Russian hacking tools hijacked Ukrainian drones, and the drone operators saw their drones drift away helplessly behind enemy lines. A Ukrainian soldier called Alexander said that Russian artillery fire were relentless. They were just hitting us all the time. If we fire 3 mortars, they fire 20 in return. And there's lots of complaints about the fact that they were lacking. The Ukrainians had to carefully ration their ammunition, whereas the Russians seem to have an unending supply of ammunition themselves. And they also complain about the enormously effective Russian electronic warfare capabilities. They say that they ended their shifts, turned on their mobile phones to call and text their family members, something which I find extraordinary, by the way, and which suggests very slack discipline, at least to my mind. But that the moment they did that, they immediately drew Russian fire upon themselves. And on a specific issue, which is Vysokopolye, this village near the Ungulets River, where the Ukrainians raised a flag, and which for a short, brief time was the topic of much excited commentary in the Western media. Well, the Washington Post tried to send journalists there to verify whether it was indeed the case that the Ukrainians were, in fact, in control of Vysokopolye. But when they tried to reach Vysokopolye, they were turned back by Ukrainian troops who told them that this village is still being contested, which is, of course, exactly what the Russians have been saying, as I've discussed in my previous videos. So all of this commentary, and this is all coming from the Washington Post now. As I said, I'm taking this from the Moon of Alabama, and I'm really grateful to them, by the way, for publishing all this information. Bernard, who runs the Moon of Alabama. But anyway, all of this reporting by the Washington Post in effect corroborates the Russian accounts of the fighting in Kherson. The Ukrainians launched this offensive, tried to advance over the open steppe against the Russians. They were shelled, they were bombed, they were surveyed, they were harassed by electronic warfare systems. They came up against extremely well-trained and tough Russian troops, many of them paratroopers, and they were smashed. And I think that I'm now going to start to take these Russian casualty totals that we're getting increasingly seriously. Bernhardt, the person who runs the Moon of Alabama blog, he says he does, and I think he's probably right. So this Washington Post article provides important corroboration for what the Russians have been reporting, and it leads us to think once more that when the Russians, the Russian Ministry of Defense included, reports something as having happened, that report is by and large reliable. So, a disaster, or so it seems, in Kherson, a renewed attempt to achieve some outcome in Kharkov region. General Zelensky apparently advised General Zaluzhny apparently advised President Zelensky before he started his Kherson offensive that the Kherson offensive was certain to fail, that the focus should instead be on Kharkov region. As of this moment in time, it does seem as if the Ukrainians have had rather more success in Kharkov region than they did in Kherson region. Well, that's not difficult, but I remain of the view that over the next few days the Russians will come in force and they'll start sorting these problems out, though undoubtedly some bitterness and anger, a residual bitterness and anger will continue and will remain. So that's so far the tale of these two offensives. There is obviously a possibility that the Ukrainians could try something again in Kherson region over the next few days. There's also a very dynamic and fluid situation with this offensive in Kharkov region. Obviously, what I'm telling you is up to date with the situation as I am making this video, but it may already be superseded or have been superseded by events by the time you watch this video. I can only do what I can, reporting, discussing, commenting upon the information that's presented to me at any particular time. But that's, it seems to me, as of this moment, where we are. I will make two quick observations about this. The first is about this enormous abundance of artillery fire that the Russians have been able to show in Kherson region. Well, if you take your mind back a few days, weeks, we were all hearing about these missile strikes on the bridges across the Dnieper, how they were going to create enormous supply problems for the Russians. Well, little sign of that. If we follow the Washington Post article, it seems that the Russians were abundantly supplied with ammunition, with surveillance drones, with everything you can imagine. So it doesn't seem so far as if all of these attacks on those bridges have actually achieved very much, at least not very much in military terms. And the second thing is, of course, the obvious point, which is that, of course, if the Kharkov offensive fails, then Ukraine will have depleted its forces in another crucial area at a time when the Russian steamroller is steadily and remorselessly continuing to move forward, principally in southern Donbass, and with the Russians able to resupply and re-equip. I don't know whether launching these offensives instead of husbanding resources is a particularly good idea. While I'm on the subject, by the way, of Russian resupply, there's been some really odd reporting again, this time that the Russians are importing millions of shells and rockets from North Korea, of all places. I would take that claim I would treat that claim with no credibility. To my mind, it has no credibility at all. But we still get all kinds of stories about Iranian drones appearing on the battlefields. Now, this has been a long-running story, but so far, I have to say that despite all kinds of claims about Iranian drones, I haven't seen any evidence that the Russians have deployed any drones from Iran anywhere in the battlefields of Ukraine. Now, there is one thing I will say, however. Over the course of the last few hours, I have seen film taken from a Russian aircraft of a Russian airstrike which destroyed one of the pontoon bridges that the Ukrainians built across the Ingulets River in this bridgehead near Andreyka. And the thing that immediately struck me was how small this river is. This is clearly not a stream, but it is a small river. Building pontoon bridges across it is not, you don't require vast amounts of equipment and machinery. And perhaps I'm wrong here, but it also looked rather shallow. I'm not saying again that a man could wade across it, but perhaps a tank could. just guessing. Now, that perhaps does create for the Russians a problem, which is that while the Ingulets River might be an obstacle for an organized Ukrainian force trying to cross into Kherson region, it's probably not a serious obstacle if you send small numbers of infiltrators, units like that, to cross over into the Russian occupied areas of Kherson region. And one way to solve that problem might be to patrol this river with drones. Now, the Russians have an enormous number of small Orlan 10 drones, but they're not really adapted for long-term surveillance. And it could be that the purpose, if the Russians are importing Iranian drones, it is so that they can monitor more closely what the Ukrainians are doing on the Ingulets River. And if these drones possess missiles, which they probably presumably will, in that case to launch missile strikes on any small groups of Ukrainian infiltrators who are trying to cross the Ingulets River in any particular place. But just a guess. Now, I say all of that. Of course, I'm not even sure that there are any Iranian drones heading in Russia's direction. No doubt we will find out all about that in due course. But anyway, that is where we are. A Kherson offensive, which is at a standstill, a Ukrainian offensive near Balaklia and south of Izium, which is still developing, which hasn't yet achieved any particular objectives, but which is clearly causing the Russians some problems and some concern, and which the Russians are going to have to deal with. And that, it seems to me, is a summary of the situation on the battlefields. There's lots more reports about what's going on in southern Donbass, about the Russians making, or rather the Russian allied forces making progress in Solidar and Bakhmut and all this. But I'm going to leave that to a later program, because I want today to cover a fairly lengthy speech that was given by President Putin at the Far Eastern Economic Plenum, which has taken place somewhere in Russia's Far East. I presume in Vladivostok, but I'm not absolutely sure. Anyway, it was a long speech, and it covered a lot of ground. And it also, by the way, showed Putin in very confident form. I mean, putting aside whatever problems the Russian troops may be having in Balaklia, he clearly seems to feel that things overall are going his way. But he did say a number of rather interesting things about various topics. One thing that has attracted a lot of attention is that he came across as genuinely angry about the whole export, the Ukrainian grain export story. He said that all of the talk about Ukrainian grain exports, it had been presented in the media by the Western powers as Russia creating a food crisis in the global south by depriving the global south of Ukrainian grain. And he spoke about the efforts that he personally and President Erdogan of Turkey had made to try to unblock Ukrainian grain exports or ship-borne Ukrainian grain exports. He made it very clear, again, that Russia has never actually blockaded or sought to obstruct Ukrainian grain exports. But anyway, he said that what then happened is that when the grain did start to get shipped, it didn't go to the global south, despite all the talk from the West about it being needed there. It ended up instead in the European Union. And he said that this was a con trick and a hoax, and that he was very angry about it, and is apparently going to discuss it all with Erdogan and see what the Turks can do. Anyway, that's been widely covered in the international media. Most of the speech actually was not about these things. It was about the redirection, the pivot that Russia economically is making towards the Far East. The fact that Russia is gradually disengaging from Europe and is now committing itself or recommitting itself to a much stronger economic relationship with the Far East. He spoke about how Power of Siberia 2, this second gas pipeline, is now been, all its terms have now been agreed with China. And he also spoke about how Russian gas trade with China is now going to move onto a ruble RMB currency basis. It's no longer going to be denominated in euros, as seemed to have been agreed a few months ago between Xi Jinping and Putin. And of course, it's not going to be in dollars either. So he talked an awful lot about this, but he also talked about two other topics. He talked about a lot of other topics, but he specifically talked about two topics, and these are the two topics I'm going to discuss now, and which I'm going to quote his actual words from. Now, I've had a lot of pushback from many people, especially in Russia, by the way, about my own opinion that the talk about the turbines, the fact that Nord Stream 1 is now essentially inoperable, that the Russians are perhaps being a little disingenuous about this, that this issue about the turbines isn't real, and that the Russians are in fact deliberately dialing down gas via Nord Stream 1. Well, I still tend to that view, but I think it would be helpful to know what Putin himself is saying about this. And I'm going to quote him in full. This is what he says about the reasons why Nord Stream 1 is not operating and why Russian gas flows to Europe have now fallen to such an extent. He says this: Nord Stream 1 is practically closed and everyone is saying Russia is using its energy weapon. More nonsense and rubbish. What weapon are we using? We supply as much gas as our partners need, as much as they order. We are not pumping gas into the air, but supplying the amount ordered. We fill the orders that we received. What has happened? The operation of one of the two gas pipelines running across Ukraine was suspended by Ukraine for a made-up reason, alleging that there was no control over it. They closed it themselves. It was not us who closed it. Ukraine did it. That is my first point. Another pipeline, Yamal Europe, runs across Poland. Poland imposed sanctions on this gas pipeline and suspended its functioning. Was it us who did this? No, the Poles did it. The Ukrainians did it and the Poles. Regarding Nord Stream 1, our German partners have agreed that all technical aspects of Nord Stream 1, including the maintenance of gas pumping turbine units, are subject to British law because I myself was unaware of this and learned about this from Gazprom CEO Mr. Miller. Gazprom had to sign a contract for the maintenance of these units made by Siemens, not with the Siemens main office, but with a subsidiary based in the United Kingdom, which slapped sanctions on Gazprom and agreed to repair the turbines at a Siemens plant in Canada. Now, before I continue, it's now something it's been explained to me that these turbines use turbine technology from the Rolls-Royce RB211 engine, an aircraft engine, high pipe bypass turbofan engine developed by Rolls-Royce in the 1970s. So it uses what is ultimately British technology. Now, the rights to the RB211 were apparently passed on to Siemens some time ago, but it's perhaps because Siemens is using elements of a British engine to build these pipelines. That may be the reason why this whole operation of these turbines, the contracts with these turbines, were signed with a Siemens subsidiary in Britain. Anyway, just to continue what Putin went on to say. What do we have to do with all of that? Canada finally took it, but yielded to numerous requests. This is it being the turbine, but yielded to numerous requests coming from Germany and gave it to Germany. Whereas, under the agreement with the Siemens subsidiary in the UK, the turbines were to be shipped straight to St. Petersburg. Logistics arrangements have changed and the contract has to be revised. In other words, the Siemens subsidiary was supposed to send the turbine directly to the Russians in St. Petersburg. Instead, it sent the turbine from Canada to Germany instead. And that is already a variation, a unilateral variation of the contract with Gazprom, and is in effect a breach of that contract. And then Putin then goes on to say the following: you can take as many photos with the turbine as you want, but give us the documents. This is our property. We need to understand the legal status of this property and its technical condition. They give us nothing but chit-chat. The last turbine is now out of order, so Siemens representatives came to look at it. There is an oil leak, which is an explosion and fire hazard. There is no way for the turbine to remain operational given its current condition. Give us the turbines and we will turn on Nord Stream 1 overnight. They do not give us anything. They say we are weaponizing it. What are they talking about? They themselves mess things up big time and are now not sure what to do about it. They drove themselves into a sanctions dead end. So that's what Putin is saying. Now, I've heard that Siemens themselves have come forward and said that this isn't correct. I've never seen anywhere in any media outlet in the West any explanation of how this is not correct. I still think that the Russians could probably get some gas going down Nord Stream 1 if they wished. But I'm not saying either that what Putin is saying here isn't true. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to discuss from what he said was about the situation in the Russian economy. And there's been lots of discussion about this, but this is what Putin himself said. He said this: "We think both the government and the presidential executive office and also our experts that we have seen the peak of the most complicated situation and that it is normalizing, which is evident from the macroeconomic indicators. First, inflation is dropping. It will reach an annual rate of 12% with a downward trend of about 5 to 6 points, maybe even the planned target number of 4% by the end of the first quarter of 2023. I hope we will see this by the second quarter. We have record low unemployment at 3.9%, a major indicator of the country's economic condition. It is much higher in the developed economies. Our state finances have stabilized. I want to stress that this year's budget will be drafted with a surplus of almost 500 billion rubles. There were predictions that we would have a sharp downturn in the economy and in GDP. There were predictions, in fact, at the start of this year that when the sanctions were imposed, that GDP in Russia would contract by 15%. Some said much more than that. Anyway, he then goes on to say there will be a drop, but it will be insignificant, about 2% or slightly over 2%. Now, a few weeks ago, the Russian Economics Ministry and the central bank were talking about a 4% contraction. It looks as if that's been revised, and various officials, not just Putin, are now saying that it will only be a 2% contraction. And then he goes on to say, so I think the government has managed to prevent these negative developments through effective, energetic and carefully measured steps. The consolidated budgets of the constituent entities of the Russian Federation will be drafted very positively as well, I think with a surplus of 1.5 trillion rubles. We're implementing all of our programs, all development programs. Moreover, this year, federal budget spending will exceed last year's by 20%. This shows that we are supporting all the areas that we set as priorities earlier. It certainly impacts the overall Russian economy. So, that's his take on the state of the Russian economy. A minor contraction this year, steady employment, falling prices, and a GDP contraction of no more than 2%, with good prospects for inflation falling to 4% in Russia at some point next year, maybe in the first half of next year, and also of the economy in general achieving a general recovery. Now, I know lots of people in the West who claim otherwise. They say that the Russian economy is in a downward spiral. Things are going from bad to worse. There was that long piece by Professor Sommerfeld, which from Yale University, based on, I thought, really rather shaky data, which said that the Russian economy was at a standstill. If Putin is lying, then I have to say he's telling the most outrageous lie that has ever been told. And I don't think he is lying for the very simple reason that what he is saying is consistent with the information I'm getting from people in Russia. So, there we are. It doesn't look as if the sanctions have been at all successful in weakening Russia's economy. Now, I would say Putin also had quite a lot to say about the oil cap ideas, the price cap ideas on Russian oil and Russian gas. He was scathing about them. He didn't say anything, in my opinion, that was particularly different from things others, including myself, have said. So I'm not going to deal with that. He is very confident. He seems very confident that Russia will be able to continue to export its oil and gas and will find plenty of customers for them, and that the oil price cap isn't going to work. And I have no doubt that he is right. Well, all of this is going on, and I can't help to compare but contrast Putin's speech at this forum, which is as a packed with facts and figures. He talks at length about the condition of Russian ports, about the work that's been done to sort out the airlines, and all kinds of things. It's full of that kind of thing, with the kind of government programs that we're seeing from the new Prime Minister of Britain, Liz Truss, and from her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng. I mean, the long and the short of it is, along with price caps on gas, energy use, energy costs, we're going to see another spend by the British government of £130 billion. Now, within not such long memory, these figures, £130 billion, would have seemed astonishing. What is happening in the West, or so it seems to me, is that whenever we run into any kind of economic problem, we throw money at it. We do that in one of three ways. Either we cut interest rates, which makes it very easy to borrow. And of course, a lot of the borrowing is a form of money creation, because the banks that lend money are in effect creating money, or at least to a great extent they are. The other way we do it is by cutting taxes, and Liz Truss, as well as spending a lot more, is intending to cut taxes. And the third is, of course, increasingly active money creation by finance ministries and central banks. And that's been going on a huge scale. And it's been fascinating and rather disturbing to see how this pattern has accelerated ever since the stock market crash of 1987. And with every bump in the road, however bad it is, there's always, or how even minor it is, the response always is to try to deal with the problem, not by thinking about what is the underlying cause and trying to address that cause, but by turning up the financial spigot. Now, there's a whole cluster of economists who say this is fine. We can go on doing this in the West indefinitely, that this isn't a problem. I have to say, I don't share those sentiments. It seems to me that what's happened instead is that our industries have quietly lost competitiveness and rotted away. The fabric of our societies has degraded, and of course economic inequality has increased to almost insane levels. But that's apparently what we intend to continue doing. Putin looks at things differently. He looks for new economic partnerships. He's heavily involved in the details of decision making, as you could see from my two excerpts from his speech. He isn't the only leader, by the way, who looks at matters with that sort of level of detail. I've no doubt at all that the Chinese leadership does so also. It doesn't mean that they always get it right, but at least they do address real problems. We, instead, in the West, we just spend money. Well, I'm going to just, on that rather sour note, I'm going to end this program today. Obviously, in my next program, I will be covering whatever the latest developments on the battlefields in Ukraine are. And of course, we also have all the many issues relating to the problems globally, around the world, and in the global economy. Well, thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Remember, you can find all my videos and Duran videos and Alex Christoforou videos on our other platforms, first and foremost locals, but also Rumble and ODYSEE and BitChute and Telegram. And you can also join us, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You'll find links under this video. You can also, you should also check out our shop and see the great things that we have there. Our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, please don't forget, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.